I won't be stepping on that stage with you. 6 careless words. That was all my biological father threw at me exactly 3 days before my Purple Heart pinning ceremony. Without a single ounce of pity for the bullet scars still throbbing on my arm, he refused simply because my older sister, a politician's wife, found it an eyesore to see me in the headlines instead of her. 10 minutes later, my mother delivered the fatal stab. Just get the medal by yourself. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's just a piece of metal. Just a piece of metal. Something I traded my life for in a combat zone. They stripped away the proudest moment of my life, dead set on the idea that I would walk up to that podium with my head down like some abandoned outcast. But they were dead wrong. Exactly 48 hours later, as my name was called in front of 200 enlisted men and women standing at attention, the blood drained from my father's face. He bit his lip in sheer panic when he saw the true identity of the man who walked out from behind those doors holding my arm. If you believe family should be the people in the trenches with you, not the ones shooting you in the back, let me know where you're listening from. In the comments, hit subscribe and ride this out with me to the bitter end. The line went dead. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone across the bathroom. My hand, halfway through working a thick layer of black polish into the leather of my combat boots, just froze mid-air. The acrid, heavy stench of the chemical paste burned the back of my throat. I didn't reach for the screen with my grease-stained fingers. Instead, I dropped my elbow hard onto the speakerphone button. Click. The room plunged into a suffocating silence. The only sound left was the steady mechanical thud of my own heartbeat. It was a slow, controlled rhythm, the kind of pulse you develop when you're used to breathing through mortar fire and incoming artillery. The cold from the bathroom floor tiles seeped through my issued olive drab socks, anchoring me to reality. 65-year-old Arthur Marsh, a man who built a fortune in corporate banking and ruthlessly fired men twice his size, couldn't find the spine to stand next to his own flesh and blood. Why? Because Chloe said so. Exactly 10 minutes later, the screen lit up again on the granite counter. Evelyn, my mother. I stared at the name glowing in the sterile fluorescent light. I pressed accept. I didn't say hello. Sarah. Her voice clipped through the speaker, sharp and grating like a faulty radio transmission. Arthur told me he talked to you. Just get the medal by yourself. Don't make a big deal out of it. I kept my jaw locked tight. The muscles in my neck strained. It's just a piece of metal, she sighed. I could hear the ice clinking in whatever expensive afternoon cocktail she was nursing. Chloe has Julian's fundraising gala that same weekend. You know how the press is right now. We can't have them running photos of you in that uniform, dragging attention away from the campaign. People will ask questions about your injury. It's bad optics. Be an adult about this. Bad optics. She talked about the blood I spilled in the sandbox, like I was a toddler demanding an overpriced plastic toy at the mall. She didn't ask if the nerve damage still kept me awake at 3 a.m. She didn't ask if my hand still shook when I held a wrench. I didn't utter a single syllable. I just pressed my thumb down on the red icon. Call ended. I stood up. My knees popped in the quiet room. I grabbed the tin of black shoe polish, twisted the metal lid on tight, and chucked it into my wooden footlocker. It hit the bottom with a dull, hollow thud. I walked out to the bedroom and stopped in front of the full-length mirror. My army dress blues hung on the rack, perfectly pressed, razor-sharp creases running down the trousers, brass buttons polished to a blinding shine. It was a uniform that commanded respect from generals. It was a uniform men died in. To my family, it was nothing more than a janitor's outfit. I looked down at my right forearm. The skin was a raised, jagged mess of purple and white tissue. It was thick, ugly, and unforgiving. The physical receipt of a .50 caliber round that nearly tore my arm clean off while I was hauling a bleeding combat medic over a pontoon bridge in Fallujah. This was the eyesore. To the Marsh family, the blood I left in the Middle East held zero currency. It was completely worthless compared to a glossy magazine spread of my 35-year-old sister Chloe, draped in a $3,000 designer gown, playing the role of the perfect politician's wife. My sacrifice was an inconvenience to her public relations strategy. Her fake smile mattered more than my survival. I turned my back to the mirror. The air in the room felt heavy. I needed to ground myself. My eyes scanned the room and locked onto the top shelf of my bookcase. It sat right between a glass-encased commendation ribbon and a framed photo of my old combat engineering unit. It wasn't brass, it wasn't shiny. It was a chunk of rotting, splintered plywood. The edges were hacked uneven and stained with dirt that had long since turned to dust. I walked over and picked it up. The wood was heavy in my palm. I ran my calloused thumb over the rough, splintered grain. The coarse friction scraped against my skin, sending a jolt straight up my arm. It was a physical shock, a phantom pain that had absolutely nothing to do with shrapnel or bullets. That rough texture, it was sickeningly familiar. It didn't belong to the desert. It belonged to Connecticut. To a perfectly manicured lawn and a massive colonial house that smelled like expensive perfume and hollow promises. My thumb pressed harder against a rusty bent nail sticking out of the wood. The sharp prick grounded me, but it also dragged me violently backward. Back to the exact moment I learned my place in the food chain. Back to when I was 14 years old, standing in the dirt, realizing for the very first time that I was nothing more than defective merchandise in this bloodline. The splintered edge of the shelf under my thumb wasn't just rough wood. It was a time machine. It dragged me kicking and screaming back to the exact moment I realized my blood meant nothing to the people who gave it to me. Growing up in Connecticut, you learn to smell the money before you even see the houses. Our neighborhood was a fortress of iron gates, imported landscaping, and fake smiles. In that house, Chloe was the living, breathing trophy. 3 years older than me. Straight A's, custom-tailored prep school skirts. The undisputed star of the regional debate circuit. My dad, Arthur, loved to show her off. I can still hear the heavy clink of his scotch glass against the mahogany study table whenever his banking partners came over. He'd put a heavy, proud hand on Chloe's shoulder. This one, he'd say, his chest puffed out. She's built for the top floor. Me, I was 14. I spent my afternoons at the local auto salvage yard. I didn't care about debate prep or designer labels. I'd crawl through the basement window smelling like diesel fuel, oxidized metal, and cheap transmission fluid, praying I wouldn't track black grease onto Evelyn's pristine white Persian rugs. I didn't fit the mold. I didn't want to. That spring, the county announced a structural engineering competition. Chloe was busy practicing her vocal inflections in the mirror for the state qualifiers. I was 2 miles down the road, dragging scrap materials out of a residential construction dumpster. I didn't ask for help. I hauled half-rotted plywood panels by hand. I dragged 50-pound sandbags across the asphalt until my shoulders screamed and my palms tore open. I spent 3 weeks building a 7-foot tactical defensive bunker right in the middle of our backyard. It was crude. It was ugly. It was held together by mismatched screws, rusted nails, and sheer stubbornness. And it completely wrecked Evelyn's perfectly manicured French topiary garden. It looked like a war zone dropped straight into the middle of a country club. But it held weight. It absorbed impact. That ugly, splintered wooden box won me first place in the tri-state engineering bracket. A massive, heavy brass cup with my name stamped right on the base. The award ceremony was held on a Thursday afternoon in a sweltering high school gymnasium. It just so happened to be the exact same afternoon as Chloe's debate semifinals. I stood next to my reinforced bunker model for 2 solid hours. The air in the gym smelled like floor wax and stale sweat. I gripped that brass cup so hard my knuckles turned a dead, sickly white. I watched the other kids take photos with their parents. Flashes going off, shoulders getting squeezed, proud smiles. Then the crowd thinned out. The janitors started folding up the metal folding chairs. They clanged loudly against the wooden bleachers. The judges packed their briefcases and walked out. The heavy double doors of the gym finally swung open. My dad walked in, 40 minutes late. He didn't look out of breath. He didn't look apologetic. He smelled like Tom Ford cologne and peppermint gum. He was staring down at the glowing screen of his phone, typing an email with one hand. His expensive leather shoes squeaked against the polished floor. He finally looked up, his eyes sweeping over the empty gym before landing on me. He walked over. He didn't hug me. He didn't even look at the bunker I'd bled over for almost a month. He glanced at the cup in my hands, gave a stiff, distracted nod, and looked back at his screen. "Good job," he muttered. He tossed the words at me, just flicked them in my direction, like throwing a dirty quarter at a beggar holding a cardboard sign at an intersection. "Let's go," Chloe's waiting in the car. We have dinner reservations. We didn't celebrate my win. We went home to toast to Chloe making it to the finals. That night the house was quiet. I stood in the dark kitchen pouring a glass of tap water. The sliding glass doors to the patio were cracked open. My parents were standing outside on the stone terrace. The sharp click-clack of Evelyn's high heels cut through the cool night air. She was holding a glass of Chardonnay. I watched her raise a perfectly filed acrylic nail, pointing straight at my 7-foot bunker sitting in the dark yard. "It's an eyesore, Arthur." Her voice sliced through the screen door. It was cold, venomous. "It looks like low-class trash. It makes us look like we live in a trailer park. Get someone to tear it down tomorrow. I can't even look out my own window without feeling sick." I froze. The cold water spilled over my hand, but I didn't feel it. I waited for him to say something, to defend it, to tell her it won first place, to tell her I built it with my bare hands. Arthur took a slow sip of his drink. The ice clinked softly in his glass. He didn't even turn his head. "I'll call the landscapers in the morning," he said. He erased me, just like that, without a second thought. I set the glass down on the granite counter. I didn't cry. Crying was for people who thought someone would come comfort them. I walked out the back door, slipped past them in the dark, and crawled straight into the heavy wooden bunker. I sat on the cold dirt floor. The air inside smelled like damp earth and fresh sawdust. I pulled my knees to my chest. My right hand throbbed to the beat of my heart. I looked down. In the pale moonlight bleeding through the wooden cracks, I saw it. A massive, jagged wood splinter had jammed deep under my thumb during the final build. The blood had dried into a dark, crusty line running down my palm. I didn't pull it out. I pressed my good thumb against the wound. Hard. I drove the splinter deeper into the skin, letting the sharp, biting pain shoot up my arm. I needed that pain to drown out the noise in my head. They didn't see me. They never would. To them, I was just the dirt tracking onto their clean floors. That bitter realization didn't die in the dirt that night. It didn't fade away. It took root in the dark. It grew, feeding on every slight, every ignored achievement, just waiting to stab me right in the chest on the exact day I put on my high school graduation gown. The week I graduated high school, Chloe dropped a bomb that sucked the oxygen out of the entire house. She announced her engagement to Julian, a slick, fast-talking lobbyist from DC, and casually mentioned her new promotion to PR director at a top-tier firm. That was all it took. The backyard barbecue Arthur and Evelyn had half-heartedly planned for my graduation was instantly canceled. Evelyn didn't even ask me. She just made a phone call, threw down her platinum card, and booked the back room of a high-end steakhouse downtown. She hijacked my day and repackaged it into an engagement celebration for Chloe. A high-society networking event. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant wearing my cheap blue graduation gown. The air conditioning blasted me, carrying the smell of charred meat and expensive garlic butter. 50 people were crammed into the room. Politicians, bankers, lawyers in bespoke suits. No one looked up when I walked in, no one clapped, no one asked about my diploma. I was just a blue-collar ghost crashing a country club mixer. I found a seat at the far end of the longest table, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. I sat down and let the noise wash over me. The crystal champagne flutes clinked constantly. The sharp, high-pitched ting, ting, ting echoed off the walls. 3 different people stood up to give speeches. Every single one of them kissed Julian's ring and praised Chloe's ambition. They talked about her future. They talked about his connections. I sat in my chair staring down at my plate. I gripped a heavy silver steak knife and sawed through a tough, fatty piece of prime rib. I chewed it slowly. It tasted like ash. Every time the crowd laughed or raised a glass, I clapped right on cue. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just played my part. I was the perfect invisible backdrop. Not one person mentioned my graduation. It was absolute, unapologetic erasure. 2 weeks later, the physical mail arrived. I walked into the kitchen holding the crisp white envelope from the United States Army. Acceptance papers for the combat engineering branch. Evelyn was sitting at the marble island sipping her morning tea. She was scrolling through wedding venues on her iPad. I slid the paper across the cold marble. It stopped right next to her saucer. She lowered her iPad. Her eyes darted over the military seal. She didn't read the details. She didn't need to. Her face hardened, the muscles around her mouth pulling tight. She picked up her porcelain teacup and slammed it down onto the saucer. A sharp, dry clack cracked like a whip in the quiet kitchen. She looked me up and down. Her eyes dragged over my faded jeans and my calloused hands. "Crawling around in the mud with a bunch of grunts," she sneered. The disgust in her voice was thick and unfiltered. "It's humiliating, Sarah. I don't even know how I'm going to show my face at the club." She didn't see honor. She didn't see service. She just saw dirt. She saw a blue-collar job that didn't fit into her country club narrative. She trampled all over the one decision I made to build a life for myself, treating it like a criminal record she'd have to hide from her rich friends. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't try to explain the concept of duty to a woman who only worshipped money. I just picked up the paper, folded it in half, and walked out of the kitchen. I knew exactly what she thought of me. Martha Hayes. My late grandmother's best friend had overheard Evelyn trashing my name to the other wives at a charity luncheon months ago. I knew it all. So I went to work. I took a graveyard shift washing dishes at a diner off the interstate. I stood over a steaming industrial sink for 8 hours a night, scrubbing hardened grease off cheap ceramic plates until my hands cracked and bled. The smell of cheap dish soap and stale fryer oil seeped into my skin. I saved every single minimum wage dollar I earned. While Chloe maxed out Arthur's credit cards buying Hermes bags and Italian leather shoes for her new DC life. I bought a surplus military rucksack and a pair of steel-toe boots. The day I left for basic training, the house was empty. Nobody came out to the driveway to say goodbye. I threw my rucksack into the back of a beat-up taxi, slammed the rusted door shut, and didn't look back. I thought I was free. I thought walking into the military meant leaving the Marsh family's toxicity in the rearview mirror forever. I thought the worst of their elitist garbage was finally behind me. But I was wrong. The contempt didn't end when I put on the uniform. It just went dormant. It mutated. And when Chloe finally spat out 2 kids of her own a few years later, that cold, calculated cruelty evolved into a weapon so ruthless it brought my father to his knees. Chloe had 2 kids, Lily and Owen. They were born 3 years apart, and the second the youngest took his first breath, the power dynamic in the Marsh family permanently shifted. That was the same year Arthur retired. My father used to be a corporate shark. He was a man who fired executives over breakfast and didn't blink. But retirement stripped him of his boardroom armor. Suddenly, he was just an aging man in a massive, empty colonial house. He needed a legacy. He needed relevance. He needed those grandkids. Chloe, with the lethal instincts of a Washington, D.C. public relations director, smelled the blood in the water immediately. She realized she held the only currency that mattered anymore. The kids weren't just her children, they were leverage. They were high-yield assets, and she weaponized them with terrifying efficiency. She became the dictator of the family, using access to Lily and Owen as a blunt force instrument to keep my parents entirely under her thumb. It started with territory. The first year after Arthur retired, Chloe demanded the head of the dining table for Thanksgiving, the seat that had belonged to my father for 30 years. Arthur didn't put up a fight. He just pulled out the chair for Julian, handed him the carving knife, and took a seat near the kitchen door. He surrendered his own house just to guarantee Chloe would bring the kids over for the holidays. Then she expanded her reach. She started dictating the family's public image. I was deployed in Afghanistan at the time. A local Connecticut newspaper caught wind of my unit and ran a small page 6 story about a female combat engineer clearing improvised explosive devices outside of Kandahar. It was a 3-paragraph blurb with a blurry photo of me in full tactical gear covered in dirt and sweat. Chloe saw it. She lost her mind. She didn't see a soldier doing a job. She saw a political liability. Julian was gearing up for a state senate run on a platform built entirely around manicured family values and suburban safety. To Chloe, having a sister defusing bombs in a combat zone was too gritty. It was dirty. It was violent. Arthur called me the very next day on a crackling satellite line. I had just come off a 14-hour patrol. My boots were caked in dry mud. My ears were still ringing from a controlled detonation. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't ask if I was uninjured. Sarah, he said, his voice tight and nervous. You need to call that local paper. Tell them to retract the story. Tell them you want your name kept out of the press. Chloe is very upset. It's causing issues for Julian's campaign. I stood in the sweltering heat of the operating base, gripping the heavy plastic receiver. I looked at my hands. There was dried blood under my fingernails that didn't belong to me. You want me to hide, I said. My voice was flat, empty. Don't make this difficult, he snapped. The panic in his voice was pathetic. If you don't fix this, she's threatening to keep the kids in DC for Christmas. I'm not losing my holidays because you want attention. My pride, my service, the lives my unit saved, all of it was butchered and thrown on the altar to appease a PR agent. I hung up the phone without another word. But the true rotting core of my family didn't fully expose itself until my final weekend pass, just weeks before my Purple Heart pinning ceremony. I was at the house in Connecticut to pack up the last of my childhood belongings. I wanted nothing left in that place. It was past midnight. I walked softly down the hardwood stairs in my socks to get a glass of water. I stopped dead in my tracks in the shadows of the kitchen hallway. I pressed my back against the cold stainless steel side of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. I didn't move a muscle. My breathing slowed, entering a tactical, shallow rhythm. I became a ghost in my own house. Arthur was standing by the granite island. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the harsh bluish glow of his cell phone, resting flat on the counter. It was on speaker. Chloe's voice hissed through the tiny audio driver. It was high-pitched, venomous, and absolute. I am not asking you, Dad, she spat. If you put on a suit and go to that filthy military base next week to stand on a stage and take pictures honoring her, I am done. I will not bring Lily and Owen up for Thanksgiving. Julian and I refuse to be associated with her kind of violence. It is bad for his image. I closed my eyes. The cold from the refrigerator seeped through my shirt, chilling my spine. I waited for the pushback. I waited for the corporate shark to bare his teeth. I waited for a father to defend his daughter who had taken a .50 caliber round to the arm. Instead, I heard a heavy, wet wheeze. Arthur leaned his weight on his hands against the granite counter. His shoulders slumped forward in the dark. He looked small, weak, a pathetic shell of a man terrified of losing his playthings. Okay, Chloe, he whispered. His voice cracked. Okay, I won't go, just promise you'll bring the kids on Thursday. Good choice, she said coldly. Click. The line went dead. I didn't step out from the shadows. I didn't scream at him. I just stood there, letting the reality of my existence wash over me. The heavy kitchen doors swung open behind me. Evelyn walked in, tying the belt of her silk robe. She stopped when she saw me standing in the dark by the fridge. She glanced at Arthur, who was staring down at his phone, refusing to look up. She knew exactly what I had just heard. Evelyn didn't flinch. There was no shame in her eyes. She tilted her chin up, looking down her nose at me with a cold, calculated stare. Arthur needs his grandkids, Sarah, she said. Her voice was steady, completely devoid of empathy. Don't be selfish. Don't back your sister into a corner. I took one step back. I looked at the man refusing to meet my eyes and the woman defending him. The pecking order was finally crystal clear. It was written in stone. Chloe and Julian at the top. The grandkids right below them. The family's public image. The expensive Persian rugs. The purebred dog. And then somewhere buried deep in the dirt beneath the foundation of the house was me. I didn't say a word. I didn't nod. I turned on my heel, walked out the back door into the freezing night, and left. I was done bleeding for people who wouldn't even offer me a bandage. The absolute worst places on earth have a funny way of introducing you to the best people. For me, that introduction happened in the middle of a choking dust storm in the Middle East, surrounded by the deafening crack of incoming mortar fire. My combat engineering unit was trying to secure a temporary pontoon bridge across a dried-out riverbed. We needed a supply route. The insurgents on the ridge needed target practice. The hit didn't sound like the movies. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was just a sharp, ear-splitting crack followed by the immediate metallic taste of blood in the back of my throat. Shrapnel tore through my right forearm. It ripped through the fabric of my uniform, shredded the muscle, and bounced off the bone. I hit the dirt hard. The sky spun into a blur of brown dust and black smoke. The smell of burning diesel and raw cordite flooded my sinuses. 10 minutes later, the heavy rhythmic thumping of chopping rotor blades cut through the gunfire. A medevac Blackhawk dropped out of the sky, kicking up a massive wall of sand. That was the day I met David Vance. He didn't wear a bespoke suit. He wore a fire-retardant flight suit soaked in sweat. He leaped out of the chopper, grabbed the drag strap on the back of my tactical vest, and hauled my bleeding weight onto the metal floor grates of the cabin. He didn't look at me with pity. He didn't flinch at the blood pooling around my boots. He keyed his radio, his voice barking over the roar of the engines. "Hold on tight, Sergeant. I'm not going back empty." That was our first date. A year later, the Army sent me stateside for medical rehabilitation. The nerve damage in my arm made holding a rifle a liability. The physical therapy was brutal, but the quiet was worse. The silence in my apartment was deafening. It left too much room for the memories of Connecticut to creep back in. David saw it happening. He didn't offer empty platitudes, he just told me to get in his truck. He drove me 40 miles out of town to a corrugated steel garage sitting at the end of a long gravel driveway. I pushed the heavy metal door open. The air inside hit me like a physical wall. It smelled like raw pine, heavy wood stain, and old machine oil. A stereo in the corner was blasting a classic rock station, barely cutting through the deep, aggressive growl of an industrial table saw ripping through a thick plank of oak. Standing over the saw was Thomas Vance, David's father. He was a retired Army Command Sergeant Major, 63 years old. Forearms like tree trunks covered in faded military ink and hands completely calloused from decades of hard labor. He ran a woodworking shop specifically for combat veterans, a place to turn off the noise in their heads and focus on building something tangible. Thomas cut the power to the saw. The blade spun down to a quiet hum. He wiped his hands on a sawdust-covered denim apron and walked over. He didn't ask me how I was feeling. He didn't ask about the trauma. He looked me dead in the eye, handed me a block of coarse sandpaper, and pointed to a stack of rough-cut cedar. "Start sanding, warrior," he grunted, with the grain not against it. For the next 2 months, that shop became my bunker. I showed up 3 days a week. The repetitive physical friction of sanding wood grounded me. But my right hand was weak. Sometimes the nerve damage would flare up, and my fingers would cramp and shake uncontrollably. One afternoon, I dropped a heavy wooden mallet. It clattered loudly onto the concrete floor. I let out a sharp curse, grabbing my scarred forearm. Thomas walked over. I braced myself for the uncomfortable stare. The same look of polite disgust my mother gave me whenever my sleeve rolled up. But Thomas didn't look away. He reached out and wrapped his massive rough hand directly over the thick purple scar tissue. His grip was firm, steady. He didn't recoil. He just held my arm until the shaking stopped. A week later, I walked into the shop. Thomas was standing at the main workbench. He brushed a pile of wood shavings aside, revealing a custom-built, dark walnut shadow box. The wood was stained to a rich, deep brown, the corners joined with flawless precision. Behind the glass pane, mounted on black velvet, was a perfectly measured space for military medals. Down in the bottom right corner, a small brass plate caught the overhead light. It had 2 letters engraved into the metal. S.M. Thomas pushed the heavy wooden box across the workbench toward me. He leaned heavily against the table, looking at the mangled skin on my arm, and then looked right into my eyes. "These scars," he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. "They mean you stood your ground when the rest of the world folded. I am damn proud of you." My chest tightened so fast I couldn't pull in a breath. The smell of sawdust and wood glue suddenly felt overwhelming. "I'm proud of you." 32 years alive, and not a single person with the last name Marsh had ever said those words to me. It took a retired grease-stained sergeant major in a dusty garage to give me the one thing my bloodline denied me. 2 months after that, the official letter arrived in the mail. The Department of the Army had approved my Purple Heart. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the crisp military letterhead. Against my better judgment, I picked up my phone and dialed the Connecticut area code. Arthur answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The Army approved it. The Purple Heart ceremony is next month." There was a long, hollow silence on the line. 3 full seconds of dead air. "Oh," he finally muttered, just a flat, empty syllable. Before I could respond, there was a loud rustling on the other end. Evelyn snatched the receiver out of his hand. "Sarah," she demanded, completely ignoring the fact that the medal was literal proof of my near-death experience. "Is this a major event? Are there going to be large press outlets there? Any high-ranking politicians from the state?" I gripped the phone tightly. The plastic creaked under the pressure of my fingers. She didn't ask if my arm still hurt. She didn't ask what the medal meant to me. She immediately ran the calculus to see if my blood held any commercial value for Chloe's husband's campaign. If there were cameras, maybe they could use me as a prop. I didn't answer her. I didn't say goodbye. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I thought that call was the lowest they could go. I thought that was the absolute bottom of the barrel. But I was wrong. Because 3 days before the ceremony, they made the phone call that drove the final knife squarely into my back. Let's go back to that Wednesday morning, the day after Arthur bailed on me. The apartment was dead quiet, the kind of silence that usually follows a mortar strike before the screaming starts. I sat on the edge of the sofa staring straight ahead at the blank television screen. I didn't cry. I didn't punch a hole in the drywall. I just sat there breathing in slow, measured counts of 4. David was sitting next to me. He had a mug of black coffee in his hand. The steam drifted up, curling into the cold air of the living room. He didn't panic. He didn't start pacing the floor, demanding to call Connecticut to scream at my father. You don't survive flying a Black Hawk into hot landing zones by losing your head when things go sideways. David just took a slow sip of his coffee, set the ceramic mug down on the wooden coaster, and looked at me. "What do you want to do?" he asked. His voice was completely level. I turned my head. I looked at the man who had pulled my bleeding body out of the dirt. "I don't want to walk up to that podium alone," I said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement of fact. David nodded once. A short, sharp movement. "Then you won't," he said. "You have an army." I grabbed my keys off the counter. I didn't bother changing out of my gray sweatpants and oversized army t-shirt. I drove straight to the industrial park on the edge of town. I pushed the heavy metal door of the woodworking shop open. The air was thick with the smell of cut oak and industrial adhesive. Dust motes drifted lazily in the sharp beams of sunlight, cutting through the high frosted windows. Thomas was at the back table. He was running a thick block of white oak through a heavy-duty planer. Wood shavings flew through the air, sticking to his canvas apron. I didn't walk all the way in. I stopped right at the threshold. I stood up straight, locking my knees, dropping my shoulders back into a rigid posture of attention. "My father backed out," I said loudly, cutting through the mechanical whine of the machinery. "He won't stand with me at the ceremony." Thomas didn't look up immediately. He finished pushing the oak plank through the blade. He hit the big red kill switch on the side of the machine. The engine spooled down, whining lower and lower until the shop was completely silent. He wiped his massive calloused hands on a shop rag. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer a single word of useless sympathy. He didn't tell me he was sorry my family was a collection of spineless cowards. He just turned around, squared his heavy shoulders, and locked his cold steel gray eyes on mine. "When do you need me standing there?" 6 words, a command, a shield. Absolute, unquestioning loyalty from a man who didn't share a single drop of my blood, but understood the weight of the scar on my arm better than the people who brought me into the world. A cold chill ran straight up my spine. It raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I gave him a single sharp nod, turned on my heel, and walked out. The next afternoon, Thursday, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Martha Hayes standing on my porch. She was 68 years old, wearing a black wool coat despite the mild weather. Martha was the president of the local Gold Star Mothers chapter. She was also the only woman my late grandmother Eleanor ever truly trusted. Martha didn't smile. She didn't offer small talk. She reached into her black leather purse and pulled out a sealed, yellowed envelope. "Eleanor gave this to me 11 years ago." Martha said, her voice tight. "She told me to hold on to it until the day you achieved your highest honor. She knew Arthur and Evelyn would try to ruin it." I took the envelope. The paper felt dry and brittle under my fingers. It smelled like old cedar and peppermint. I thanked Martha, closed the door, and walked into the kitchen. I pulled a tactical folding knife out of my pocket. I flipped the blade open with my thumb and sliced cleanly through the top of the envelope. The paper made a sharp, dry tearing sound. I pulled out a single sheet of stationery. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Sarah. I know how those vain, miserable people operate. I see the way they look at you, and I see the way they worship your sister. Do not wait for their approval. You will die waiting. They are hollow. Family isn't blood, Sarah. Family is the people willing to stand in the trench with you when the bullets start flying. Do not let them take your pride. Love, Grandma Eleanor. I stared at the faded blue ink. My grandmother had seen the rot in the Marsh family over a decade ago. She knew exactly what they were. If you've ever had to build your own family because the one you were born into left you bleeding in the dirt, hit the like button right now. Leave a comment saying, I am my own army. And subscribe to the channel if you're ready to see how a real soldier handles a betrayal. I folded the brittle paper in half. I didn't shed a tear. The desert had burned the capacity for crying out of me a long time ago. I slid the letter into the left breast pocket of my shirt right over my heart. I closed the tactical knife with a loud metallic snap. I was done playing defense. I was done waiting for permission to exist. The clock was ticking down to Saturday. I was ready to go to war. The heavy iron hissed like an angry snake. A thick, suffocating cloud of steam hit my face as I pressed the scorching metal down onto the dark blue fabric of my uniform trousers. I drove the sharp edge of the iron along the crease, up and down. Hard, measured, punishing strokes. The smell of hot wool and starch filled the small apartment. My phone vibrated against the cheap laminate of the ironing board. Then it vibrated again, and again. A rapid, frantic buzzing that sounded like a dying insect trapped in a jar. I didn't stop ironing. I didn't break my rhythm. I just glanced down at the glowing screen. Chloe. 9 unread messages in under 60 seconds. She had sniffed out the trail. Someone at the base PR office must have leaked that the Marsh family had been bumped from the VIP escort roster for the ceremony. I hear you're not walking alone tomorrow. Who are you dragging onto that stage? If you bring some trashy enlisted grunt to embarrass Julian's campaign, I swear to God I set the iron upright. I reached over, picked up the phone, and flipped it face down on the board. The plastic case gave a dull smack against the wood. The buzzing was instantly muffled. I went back to my trousers. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I just felt a deep, hollow nausea, a profound disgust at how utterly pathetic she was. Chloe realized I wasn't going to take the bait, so like a rabid dog looking for a piece of meat, she shifted targets. She went after my commanding officer. 12 miles away, sitting on the rusted metal tailgate of her beat-up Ford pickup, Captain Jessica Ruiz cracked open a cold Miller Lite. The aluminum tab popped loud in the quiet night air. The neon sign from the dive bar across the street buzzed, casting a dirty red glow over the gravel parking lot. Jessica was a steel-plated combat veteran, a woman who had pulled 2 bleeding men out of a burning Humvee in Mosul. She didn't rattle. Her phone lit up on the truck bed. An unknown number. It was a massive wall of text. A frantic, unhinged manifesto from a PR director rapidly losing her grip on the narrative. Chloe was demanding the official guest list. She was demanding to know who was walking with me. She threatened to call the base commander and formally complain about unauthorized personnel ruining a private family event. Jessica took a slow sip of her cheap beer. She stared at the blocks of frantic text from a woman who had never seen a day of hard labor in her entire pampered life. Jessica didn't type out a paragraph explaining military protocol. She didn't argue. She didn't justify my existence. She tapped the glass screen exactly 2 times. She typed a single period. Send. 1 dot. It was the ultimate unapologetic middle finger from the United States Army to a spoiled civilian. A complete dismissal of Chloe's authority. Miles away in her DC townhouse, Chloe lost her mind. She screamed at her phone and immediately dialed our father. 10:15 p.m., Connecticut. The massive colonial house was dead quiet, the kind of expensive, suffocating silence that only money buys. Arthur Marsh stood in the dark of his mahogany-paneled study. The only light came from the glowing screen of his cell phone, resting flat on the heavy leather desk pad. He wasn't looking at the phone. He was holding something else in his trembling hands. It was the heavy brass cup attached to a chunk of ugly splintered wood. My first place engineering trophy from when I was 14. He had kept it shoved in the very back of his bottom desk drawer for almost 2 decades. Out of sight, out of mind. His thumb traced the cheap brass plate. He picked up his phone. He opened my contact. His thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. "Dad is proud of you, Sarah." He typed the words. They sat there in the text box, glowing in the dark room. A tiny fleeting moment of actual fatherhood. A microscopic ghost of courage. Then his phone vibrated violently in his palm. A text from Chloe. "Fix this. Now. Or you don't see the kids." Arthur stared at the screen. The heavy, expensive smell of his Tom Ford cologne suddenly felt sour in the stagnant air of the study. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His chest heaved. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His thumb moved. Backspace, backspace, backspace. He erased the whole thing. He scrubbed it from existence. He chickened out. Instead, he opened a new message to David. "David, Chloe is very upset. She thinks Sarah is bringing someone to mock our family tomorrow. We don't want a scene. It's bad optics for Julian. Maybe it's best if Evelyn and I just stay home." He was trying to cut and run. He was terrified of being publicly embarrassed at his own daughter's medal ceremony. He wanted to hide. But before Arthur could hit send and finalize his cowardly retreat, the heavy oak doors of the study swung open. Evelyn stood in the doorway. She was fully dressed in her silk pajamas, a thick layer of expensive anti-aging cream smeared across her cheeks. The hallway light cast a long, sharp shadow of her into the dark room. "Put the phone down, Arthur," she snapped. Her voice was cold iron, completely void of affection. Arthur flinched like a beaten dog. "Evelyn, Chloe says..." "I don't give a damn what Chloe says right now." Evelyn stepped into the room, her eyes gleaming with a predatory, calculating hunger. "I just got off the phone with the country club board. Do you know who is attending that little pinning ceremony tomorrow?" Arthur stared at her, clueless. "The state mayor," she hissed, stepping closer. "And a 3-star general from the Pentagon. The press pool will be massive." Arthur's mouth opened slightly. The panic in his eyes shifted. "I am not missing this networking opportunity." Evelyn stated, her tone leaving zero room for debate. "Julian needs those contacts. And more importantly, I am not giving Sarah the satisfaction of playing the abandoned victim on camera. We are going. We will sit in those chairs. We will smile. And we will own the narrative." "Understood." Arthur looked down at his phone. He looked at the wooden trophy on the desk. He swallowed his guilt, bearing it right next to his spine. He nodded once. "Understood." Saturday morning. 0500 hours. The sun hadn't even breached the horizon yet. I stood in my kitchen drinking a mug of black bitter coffee. The heat burned down my throat, waking up every nerve ending in my body. My dress blues hung on the closet door, catching the harsh fluorescent kitchen light. The brass buttons gleamed. The creases were sharp enough to draw blood. I finished the coffee. I set the heavy ceramic mug down on the counter with a loud thud. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel sad. I felt the ice-cold focus of a sniper settling into a blind. My family thought they were walking into a PR stunt. They thought they could just show up, flash a fake smile, and still hold the leash. They had no idea they were walking straight into the crosshairs. 1300 hours. The air inside the base auditorium was crisp cold and smelled heavily of brass polish and starched cotton. I stood in the holding room just off the main stage, looking through a narrow split in the heavy velvet curtains. The brass band started up. A deep, thundering snare drum roll cut through the low chatter of the crowd, followed by the sharp, authoritative blast of the trumpets playing the Army marching anthem. I scanned the rows. The first 5 rows were a sea of pristine dress blues, rigid posture, and polished combat boots. 200 enlisted men and women. My eyes dragged to the very back of the hall. Row 20. The Marsh family sat huddled in the corner, completely isolated from the structured discipline of the room. They looked like cheap tourists who had wandered into the wrong building. Arthur was staring down at his shiny Oxford shoes, his shoulders hunched. Evelyn was wearing a loud, flashy cocktail dress that screamed, country club happy hour. It was completely inappropriate for a military pinning ceremony. Beside her, Chloe sat with her arms crossed tight over her chest, scanning the room with a sour, impatient scowl. She hated every second of this. She hated not being the center of attention. They were sitting back there waiting for the show, waiting to watch me drag myself out onto that massive stage completely alone. They thought I would keep my head down, accept my little piece of metal, and slink away in the shadows so they could hijack the mayor for a photo op afterward. They were dead wrong. The heavy wooden door to the holding room swung open. I turned around. It wasn't the grease-stained woodworker in a denim apron. Thomas Vance stepped into the room. He was wearing his full army dress blues. The deep blue fabric was tailored perfectly to his massive frame. 3 thick gold chevrons with 3 rockers and a star sat heavily on his sleeves. Command Sergeant Major. But it was his chest that caught the light. It was a solid wall of ribbons and medals, silver stars, bronze stars with V devices, combat infantryman badges. The metallic clinking sound they made as he walked was sharp, heavy, and completely undeniable. It was the sound of a man who had walked through hell and commanded respect from the devil himself. He stopped a few feet from me. He looked at my uniform. He looked at the scars covering my right hand resting by my side. "You look sharp, warrior," Thomas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," I replied. My voice didn't shake. Out on the stage, the music faded. The commanding officer, a 3-star general with a jawline carved out of granite, stepped up to the wooden podium. He tapped the microphone. The low feedback hummed through the massive speakers. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Marsh." The general's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceiling. I stepped out from behind the curtain. The lights hit me. I locked my eyes straight ahead. I didn't look at the back row. I marched to the center of the stage, my leather shoes cracking sharply against the hardwood floor with every step. I stopped directly in front of the general, snapping my heels together. The general looked out over the crowd. "Who will stand as the family representative for Staff Sergeant Marsh?" The silence in the auditorium was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Back in row 20, Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Evelyn leaned forward, a smug, satisfied smirk creeping onto her face. Chloe actually checked her watch. They were waiting for the awkward pause. They were waiting for me to stand there, abandoned and pathetic, and whisper that I had no one. Then the heavy boots stepped out from the front row. Thomas Vance didn't just walk, he marched. The heavy metallic clink-clank of his combat medals echoed through the dead silent room like a judge bringing down a gavel. Every single soldier in the front 5 rows instantly stiffened their posture out of pure instinctual respect for his rank. Thomas stopped at the edge of the stage. He didn't look at the general. He didn't look at the mayor. He slowly turned his massive shoulders and locked his eyes dead on row 20. He didn't need a microphone. He possessed the lungs of a drill instructor. "Her family!" Thomas roared. The sheer volume and authority in his voice rattled the glass in the exit doors. "Is every single soldier standing in this room?" It was a mortar shell dropped right onto the back row. A heavy collective breath left the crowd. In the second row, Martha Hayes pressed a tissue to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she let out a quiet sob. 3 seats down, Captain Jessica Ruiz sat perfectly rigid, but her jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched, and the rims of her eyes were bloodshot red. Thomas climbed the wooden stairs. He walked up to my right side, his presence a massive, immovable shield. He placed his heavy, calloused hand firmly on my shoulder. The heat of his grip seeped through the wool of my uniform. He stepped back. The 3-star general stepped forward. He unpinned the purple ribbon bordered in gold from the velvet box. He leaned in, his face close to mine. "You earned this, Sergeant. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise," he muttered quietly for my ears only. He drove the sharp pins through the fabric of my uniform, right over my heart. He secured the clasps. He stepped back and delivered a razor-sharp salute. I threw my right hand up the scarred tissue of my forearm, fully exposed for the entire world to see. I returned the salute. "Present arms," a voice barked from the floor. 200 boots slammed together in perfect, deafening unison. 200 right hands snapped up to the brim of their covers. A massive, impenetrable wall of respect. I held the salute. I didn't look at the mayor. I didn't look at the cameras. I dropped my eyes to the back of the room. Arthur's face was completely drained of color. He looked like he was going to vomit. Evelyn was literally shrinking down into her seat. The smug smirk completely wiped off her face, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic as she realized the room was silently judging the empty chairs next to her. Chloe was staring blankly at the stage, her mouth hanging open, utterly paralyzed by a display of power she couldn't buy, manipulate, or control. I stood there on the highest peak of my life. I looked at the people who shared my blood, and I looked right through them. They were nothing but invisible dust. But the execution wasn't over. They still had a reception to survive. The reception hall smelled of roasted beef, stale beer, and old military brass. 200 people milled around the open space. The noise was a steady low roar of clinking glasses and heavy combat boots shifting on the polished linoleum floor. I stood near the back holding a bottle of cheap domestic beer. Captain Jessica Ruiz stood next to me. She was leaning against a high-top table, watching the room with the cold, analytical eyes of a perimeter guard. Up at the front of the room, Thomas Vance tapped the microphone stand. A sharp spike of feedback cut through the noise. The room went dead silent. He didn't pull out a piece of paper. He didn't offer a polite, empty speech for the cameras. He gripped the heavy metal stand with both hands. His knuckles turned white. He looked out over the crowd and his eyes locked onto the far corner of the room, where my family stood. This woman, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that commanded absolute silence, built a bridge under active mortar fire. She bled in the dirt so the rest of us could cross. He paused. The heavy silence in the room pressed down on the crowd. Anyone who mocks her mud-stained hands, Thomas continued, his voice hardening into a weapon. Anyone who looks down on the path she chose is spitting on the exact peace they are enjoying right now. The room erupted. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was a thunderous, deafening roar of applause. Boots stomped the floor. The sound hit the back corner of the room like a physical shockwave. Through the crowd, I saw Arthur's head drop. He stared down at his expensive shoes, completely humiliated. The speech ended. The crowd dispersed. I stayed by the table. I took a slow sip of my beer. Incoming, Jessica muttered out of the side of her mouth. She didn't turn her head, just tipped her beer bottle toward the left. I turned. Arthur was weaving his way through the crowd. He looked terrible. He was sweating. The heavy, musky scent of his Tom Ford cologne hit me before he even spoke. But it couldn't mask the sour, metallic smell of his own nervous sweat. He stopped 3 feet away from me. He didn't look at the Purple Heart pinned to my chest. He couldn't. Sarah, he stammered. His voice was weak, shaky. Thomas, that was a very nice speech he gave. I didn't smile. I didn't get angry. I looked at him with the exact same dead, analytical stare I used when I inspected a cracked retaining wall that needed to be demolished. It's a shame you didn't have the spine to stand up there, I said. My voice was flat, zero emotion. Arthur physically flinched, his mouth open, fishing for an excuse. Or, I continued, cutting him off completely. Are you just ashamed because every person in this room just saw the naked reality of this family? His face crumpled. He was cornered. The corporate shark had absolutely nowhere to run. He reached a hand out, opening his mouth again. Before he could form a single word, Evelyn materialized out of the crowd. She grabbed him by the elbow. Her fingernails dug into the fabric of his suit jacket. She jerked him backward. Her face was flushed. Her jaw clenched so tight the tendons in her neck stood out. Stop embarrassing me, Arthur, she hissed through her teeth. It wasn't a whisper. It was a venomous command. She didn't look at me. She couldn't handle it. She dragged him away, choosing to protect the shattered remains of her public image rather than admit she was wrong. I watched them retreat. They were pathetic. Across the room near the exit doors, Chloe was trying to slip out unnoticed. She was clutching her purse tight against her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She just wanted to escape back to her perfect, curated DC life. She didn't make it. Martha Hayes stepped directly into her path. Martha was 6 inches shorter than Chloe, but she held her ground like a concrete pillar. Chloe stopped her fake, camera-ready smile, instantly freezing on her face. Eleanor would have been incredibly proud today, Martha said loudly, her voice carried over the low hum of the crowd. Chloe swallowed hard. Yes, well, it's a nice little event. She'd be proud. Martha continued leaning in close, her eyes boring into Chloe's. Because Sarah built a legacy with her bare hands, not a cheap PR stunt designed to cover up a rotting marriage. Chloe's face went dead white, the color completely drained from her skin. Her hand holding a half-empty glass of red wine began to shake violently. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the front of her expensive silk blouse. Martha hit the kill switch. She exposed the one secret Chloe fought desperately to keep off the internet. Julian wasn't the perfect husband. The marriage was a sham, a hollow political arrangement that was falling apart behind closed doors. Chloe couldn't speak. She dropped the wine glass onto a nearby cocktail table. The heavy crystal base slammed down with a sharp clack. She turned and ran. She didn't walk. She pushed past 2 enlisted men, shoved the heavy door to the women's restroom open, and disappeared inside. A few seconds later, the muffled, pathetic sound of heavy gasping sobs echoed out into the hallway. I stood by the high-top table watching the heavy bathroom door slowly swing shut. Exactly 10 minutes later, the clock struck 1700 hours. Through the tall glass windows of the reception hall, I watched Arthur, Evelyn, and a red-eyed Chloe slip out the side exit. They didn't walk out the front doors. They didn't shake hands with the mayor. They scuttled down the concrete ramp and disappeared into the parking lot like deserters fleeing a battlefield. I took one last drink of my beer. The bitter taste coated the back of my throat. The war with the Marsh family was officially over, but I knew exactly what was coming next. The groveling was about to begin. 2 weeks later, the heavy diesel engine of a Caterpillar excavator idled 10 yards away. The ground vibrated right through the thick rubber soles of my combat boots. The air smelled like hot asphalt, diesel exhaust, and freshly poured concrete. I stood over a makeshift plywood table wearing a neon yellow safety vest, pinning down the massive blueprints for the new base medical clinic. My phone buzzed against the wood. I didn't recognize the number. I wiped the dirt off my hands onto my cargo pants and hit accept. Sarah. It was Chloe. Her voice wasn't polished. It wasn't dripping with that arrogant DC public relations venom. It was a wet, ragged, pathetic mess. Julian had packed his bags and walked out the door 3 days ago. The marriage was officially dead. The political donors were pulling their funding, and the country club wives had already started freezing her out of their social circles. She was losing her house, her status, and her entire identity. The dam broke. The words spilled out of her like a busted water main. She was crying so hard she was choking on her own breath. She admitted it all. She admitted she tried to bury my military career because my real physical scars made her fake, manicured life feel entirely hollow. She begged me to come to DC. She needed her sister. She needed family. I stood there in the dust, watching a heavy crane swing a steel beam into place. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Chloe, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the roar of the construction site. I'm a combat engineer. I'm not your emotional sandbag. I hit the red button. I blocked the number. I dropped the phone back onto the blueprints. 3 days later, I checked my mailbox at the apartment. There was a thick, cream-colored envelope sitting inside. The handwriting was sharp and corporate. Arthur Marsh. I walked into my kitchen, tossed my keys on the counter, and grabbed a knife. I sliced the top of the envelope open. The paper smelled like his mahogany study, leather and expensive mints. I pulled out the letter. It was a full page of desperate backpedaling. Sarah, I am so proud of you. I always have been. That wooden trophy you built is still in my desk drawer. I just didn't know how to say it out loud. Thomas Vance overstepped. He stole my moment up on that stage. Please call me. I stared at the black ink. It was a pathetic, cowardly attempt to rewrite history. A grown man, a retired corporate executive, blaming a veteran for his own lack of a spine. It wasn't an apology. It was an excuse. He just wanted to siphon off a little bit of the glory he watched me receive from the back row. He wanted to feel like a father without doing any of the actual heavy lifting. I didn't tear it up immediately. I walked into the living room and opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out the yellowed, brittle envelope Martha had given me, my grandmother's letter. I set them side by side on the wooden desk. Two pieces of paper, two completely different worlds. I picked one up in my left hand and the other in my right. The difference in weight was staggering. Eleanor's letter was a heavy prophetic shield. It was forged in actual love by a woman who saw the rot in her own bloodline and tried to protect me from it. Arthur's letter was a flimsy, worthless scrap of guilt. I put Eleanor's letter back in the drawer, safely tucked away. I picked up Arthur's letter with both hands. I tore it straight down the middle. The thick paper ripped with a loud, sharp shirk. I put the halves together and tore them again. I dropped the shredded pieces into the metal trash can under the desk. I didn't write him back. I didn't call. I didn't send a text. That door was bolted shut, permanently. Going no contact wasn't a punishment for them. It was a rescue mission for me. Growing up in Connecticut society forces this lie down your throat. They tell you family is everything. They tell you family means sharing DNA, carving a dry turkey on Thanksgiving, and forgiving toxic abuse just because you have the same last name. It's a scam. Family isn't blood. Family is the guy bleeding in the dirt next to you. Family is the helicopter pilot pulling you out of the crossfire when the sky is literally falling. Family is the old man in a dusty woodshop who hands you a piece of coarse sandpaper, looks at your scars, and tells you he is proud of you. Family are the people who actually choose to stay when the cameras are off. It was late afternoon. The sun dropped lower in the sky, casting a long golden beam of light through the apartment window. The light hit the dark walnut of the shadow box resting on my shelf. The glass caught the sun, illuminating the gold border of the Purple Heart and the two brass letters riveted into the corner. SM. I didn't look back at the trash can. I turned my attention to the drafting table in the corner of the room. I dragged a large rolled-up schematic toward me. I flattened the edges with my hands. I picked up a heavy mechanical pencil. The graphite clicked sharply as I pressed the button with my thumb. I pressed the lead to the paper. I am Sarah Marsh. I am a builder. The cowards were permanently in my rearview mirror, and I had new ground to break. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. I will see you next time.